Snow had begun falling over St. Marymead shortly after midnight, covering roofs, hedges, garden walls, and the narrow lanes with such completeness that by 7 in the morning the village seemed temporarily removed from ordinary life. Nothing moved except a thin column of smoke above the vicarage and Mrs. Price Ridley's black cat making a reluctant passage beneath a hedge, while every path and doorstep remained smooth beneath several inches of fresh snow. It was precisely the sort of morning on which footprints mattered, although nobody in the village had yet been given a reason to examine them. At 7:30, Mrs. Edith Harcourt crossed the lane toward Mallow Cottage carrying a covered basket containing bread, 2 boiled eggs, and a small jar of marmalade. She had promised the previous evening to bring breakfast to her older brother, Colonel Arthur Harcourt, whose housekeeper had gone to visit a sick sister in Much Benham and had been unable to return before the snow began. Edith was 58, brisk in manner, practical in dress, and generally considered more dependable than affectionate, although her brother had always insisted that the distinction was unfair. She entered through the garden gate and stopped. There were footprints in the snow. They began at the gate, followed the path toward the cottage, and disappeared beneath the little stone porch. Edith stared at them for several seconds before continuing, because she knew perfectly well that nobody should have visited Arthur after she had left him shortly before 10 the previous night. The prints were deep and regular, apparently made by a man's boots, and there was something reassuring about their simplicity. Whoever had approached Mallow Cottage had used the gate and the path like an ordinary visitor. Edith knocked, received no answer, then tried the door and discovered it unlocked. Arthur Harcourt was in the morning room, sitting beside the cold fireplace with one hand hanging loosely beside his chair. A glass stood on the table near him, together with a half-finished bottle of whiskey, an opened envelope, and the remains of the fire he had apparently allowed to die during the night. Edith called his name once, then approached and touched his shoulder, although the stillness of the room had already told her what she would find. Within 40 minutes, Dr. Haydock had arrived, followed by Sergeant Fletcher from Much Benham, and Mallow Cottage had ceased to be merely a house in which an elderly retired colonel had died unexpectedly. There was a bruise behind Arthur's left ear. Dr. Haydock examined it twice before telling Fletcher that the injury was consistent with a heavy blow, and although he would not give a final opinion until a proper examination had been made, he saw no reasonable way of treating the death as natural. Arthur had probably been struck while seated or while beginning to rise, which suggested that whoever had killed him had been standing close enough to speak to him without causing alarm. The footprints outside immediately became important. Fletcher went to the window and looked toward the path. Where Edith's smaller prints now ran beside the older, heavier ones, the difference was obvious. Edith explained where she had walked, and Fletcher carefully examined the untouched snow around the cottage. There were no prints beneath the morning-room window, none leading through the vegetable garden, and none approaching the back door. The visitor appeared to have entered through the front. There was only one difficulty. The man's footprints went toward the house, but none came away. By 9 o'clock, this peculiar fact had become the center of the investigation. The snow had started shortly after midnight, according to Dr. Haydock, and had continued without interruption until shortly before 6. Arthur was believed to have died sometime between 11 and 1, although the estimate remained uncertain. If the visitor had arrived after the snow began, he had apparently entered Mallow Cottage and never left. If he had arrived before the snow began, however, his footprints should have been covered. Fletcher examined the marks again and noticed something Edith had not mentioned. The prints were unusually deep for a man walking on level ground, particularly near the gate where the snow was soft but not compacted. Large fellow, perhaps, he said, Edith looked toward him. Or carrying something. It was an ordinary remark, and Fletcher acknowledged it before returning his attention to the path. Later, it would matter that Edith had said it so quickly. The first obvious suspect presented himself before anyone needed to search for one. Major Stephen Bell, who lived at Ashcombe Farm, less than a mile away, had quarrelled publicly with Arthur at the Blue Boar 2 evenings earlier. Several villagers had heard Arthur accuse Bell of dishonesty over the sale of a piece of land, and Bell had responded that Arthur would regret repeating the accusation. More inconveniently, Bell owned a pair of heavy shooting boots with a broad heel similar to the marks outside Mallow Cottage. He admitted visiting Arthur the previous evening, but insisted he had left at approximately 9:15, long before the snow began. Edith confirmed seeing him leave. That should have helped him, but Fletcher was troubled by the footprints and by Bell's obvious dislike of the dead man. The situation acquired another complication when Arthur's solicitor arrived from Much Benham and revealed that Arthur had recently changed his will. Edith remained comfortably provided for, but Mallow Cottage and a substantial portion of his investments would pass to his goddaughter, Lucy Bell, Major Bell's 26-year-old daughter. By luncheon, the village possessed a quarrel, an inheritance, a threatening remark, and a trail of footprints apparently belonging to a man who had entered a house without leaving it. It possessed something else as well, although almost nobody considered it important. Miss Marple had been at Edith Harcourt's house the previous afternoon, helping with arrangements for the church winter fund. During tea, Edith had complained about her brother's habit of leaving muddy boots inside his porch rather than cleaning them properly. Arthur, she explained, kept an old pair there specifically for the garden because his housekeeper refused to allow them beyond the tiled entrance. When Miss Marple heard about the murder, she did not immediately ask who had inherited the money or what Major Bell had threatened to do. She asked whether Arthur's old garden boots were still in the porch. Sergeant Fletcher checked. They were. They stood beneath the wooden bench, damp around the solace. Fletcher touched the leather and frowned, then looked through the open door toward the white path and the deep impressions running from the gate to the cottage. The snow would make them wet, he said. Miss Marple, who had accompanied Edith back to Mallow Cottage but had remained carefully outside the investigation, looked at the boots for only a moment. Yes, she replied. If someone had been walking in snow, Fletcher glanced at her, waiting for something more, but Miss Marple had turned her attention to Edith, who was explaining to Dr. Haydock that Arthur sometimes went into the garden late at night when he could not sleep. It sounded perfectly reasonable. Most things did, at first. Outside, the snow remained almost untouched, preserving the path with extraordinary clarity, and everyone continued looking at the footprints as evidence of someone arriving at Mallow Cottage. Nobody had yet seriously considered the possibility that the footprints were telling them something quite different. By early afternoon, Mallow Cottage had acquired the uncomfortable atmosphere of a place being forced to explain itself, because every room was being examined with the assumption that some physical detail would eventually reveal how a visitor had entered during the night and then disappeared without disturbing the snow outside. Sergeant Fletcher searched the kitchen, the narrow pantry, the upstairs bedrooms, and even the small coal shed attached to the rear wall. But there was no concealed passage, no second door left unaccounted for, and no indication that anyone had climbed through a window. The front door remained the only reasonable route. That conclusion made the footprints more persuasive, and because they seemed so clear, nobody questioned the most basic assumption behind them, that each impression had been made by a person walking from the gate toward the house. Major Stephen Bell was brought to Mallow Cottage shortly after 2. wearing a heavy tweed coat and an expression that suggested irritation rather than fear. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with a military directness that made even simple answers sound defensive. And Fletcher immediately understood how easily such a temperament could be mistaken for hostility. Bell admitted the quarrel with Arthur Harcourt. He did not attempt to soften it. "Arthur called me a cheat in front of half the village," he said. "I told him I would make him regret it, which meant I intended to speak to my solicitor, not hit him over the head." Fletcher asked about the land transaction, and Bell explained that Arthur had sold him a narrow strip adjoining Ashcombe Farm, then later claimed that Bell had deliberately concealed a drainage problem that reduced the value of another neighbouring field. The disagreement had become personal, partly because both men had known one another for 30 years and possessed the dangerous confidence of old acquaintances who believed they understood exactly what the other was capable of. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace with Edith, apparently occupied with a loose thread on one glove, although she listened without interruption. Bell confirmed that he had visited Arthur at approximately 8:30 the previous evening. Edith had been present for part of the visit. According to both of them, the discussion had been unpleasant but not violent. Bell left around 9:15 and Edith departed approximately half an hour later. Arthur was alive, annoyed and drinking whiskey when she last saw him. Fletcher then asked Bell to remove one of his boots. The request irritated him considerably, but he complied. The sole was measured against the photographs and dimensions taken from the prints outside. The size was nearly identical, the heel broad enough, and one worn section along the outer edge appeared at first glance to correspond with an irregular mark visible in several impressions near the cottage. Fletcher's interest sharpened. Bell noticed. "If you believe I walked back here after midnight, say so. I'm trying to establish who did. Then you might begin by explaining how I got home again." That was precisely the problem, and Bell knew it. If he had walked to Mallow Cottage after the snow began, there should have been another set of prints leading away. If he had remained inside, the police should have found him there. If he had left through the garden, the untouched snow behind the cottage made that impossible. Bell's daughter Lucy arrived before the questioning ended. She was pale from the cold and visibly angry at finding her father treated as a suspect. Although her manner changed when she saw Edith, Lucy had known Arthur Harcourt all her life. He had been her godfather, had paid for part of her education after her mother died, and had recently begun discussing the possibility that she might manage several of his investments. She knew nothing about the new will, or claimed she did not. And the news that she would inherit Mallow Cottage seemed to disturb rather than please her. Edith watched her closely. "You must have known Arthur intended to leave you something. He once said I would have his books." "The house is rather more than books." Lucy looked directly at her. "I didn't ask for it. The exchange lasted only a few seconds." But Miss Marple's attention moved from Lucy to Edith, because Edith had spoken with the calm precision of someone testing a fact rather than reacting emotionally to bad news. Later, Fletcher asked Edith whether she resented the will. She gave a small laugh. "My brother's money was his own. I have enough." It was true. Edith was not wealthy, but she possessed a modest independent income and owned her house without debt. There was no obvious financial desperation, and she had been the person who discovered the body and immediately summoned help. For the moment, attention returned to Bell. A constable was sent to Ashcombe Farm to inspect his other boots, while Fletcher examined the porch at Mallow Cottage again. Arthur's muddy garden pear remained beneath the bench, and the dampness around the solace had begun to dry. Fletcher picked one up. The boot was smaller than Bell's, but not by much, and its tread was badly worn. More importantly, There was a fine line of white residue caught along the edge of the heel. Snow, Edith said when she saw him looking. Fletcher rubbed it between his fingers. It dissolved almost immediately. Miss Marple observed him from the doorway. There was quite a lot of snow this morning. Fletcher said more to himself than anyone else. Yes, Miss Marple replied. And very little mud. He turned toward her. She nodded toward the boot. Arthur was said to use those for the garden. The garden outside was completely covered in white. Fletcher looked toward the back window, where the vegetable beds lay beneath several inches of undisturbed snow. If he wore them after midnight, there should be prints out there. Quite. But there aren't. No, Miss Marple offered nothing further. The constable returned from Ashcombe Farm Nearfor with a disappointing result. Belle owned 3 pairs of heavy outdoor boots, but none produced an exact match to the prints. The worn edge Fletcher had noticed was similar, although not sufficiently distinctive to prove anything. More significantly, two farm workers stated that Belle had returned home before 10 and remained there throughout the night. One of them had spoken to him shortly after midnight when a pipe in the stable froze. The case against Belle weakened. The footprints did not. As evening approached, Fletcher stood at the sitting-room window studying the path again. Increasingly frustrated by evidence that appeared decisive while refusing to explain itself, Edith entered carrying a tray of tea. "You've been staring at those marks for 10 minutes," she said. "I keep thinking I'm missing something." She placed the tray on the table. Perhaps whoever came here never intended to leave by the same route. Fletcher looked toward the untouched garden. "There isn't another route." Edith followed his gaze and said nothing. Miss Marple, seated quietly beside Lucy, watched Edith place the cups in front of them. She noticed that Edith served Lucy without asking how she took her tea, adding milk but no sugar. Lucy accepted it without comment. It was an insignificant courtesy between 2 women who had known each other for years. Yet Miss Marple's eyes rested on the cup for a moment longer than necessary. Then Edith poured her own tea, 2 sugars. Fletcher returned to the porch before darkness made further examination difficult. And this time he crouched beside the old garden boots rather than the footprints outside. One sole was damp, the other was almost dry. He touched them both, then looked back toward the path. For the first time, he seemed less interested in who might have walked toward the house and more interested in why Arthur Harcourt's boots appeared to have been used at all. Miss Marple said nothing. She did not need to. Someone else had finally begun to look at the right thing. If you enjoy mysteries where the answer is hidden inside ordinary behavior rather than concealed behind an impossible trick, subscribing to the channel will help you follow more stories in which the smallest familiar detail often matters more than the loudest clue. The following morning brought no new snow, and this proved unexpectedly useful, because the impressions along the path remained clear enough for Sergeant Fletcher to examine them without the urgency that had governed the previous day. He arrived at Mallow Cottage shortly after 8 with Constable Reeves and a measuring rule, while Miss Marple came half an hour later with Edith, who had been asked to identify several objects found among her brother's papers. Fletcher had spent much of the night thinking about Arthur's garden boots. One had been noticeably wetter than the other when he examined them, and although that difference could have resulted from the way they had been placed beneath the porch bench, it disturbed him because the footprints outside already contained too many convenient explanations. Belle's boots were similar but not identical. Arthur's own boots showed signs of recent contact with snow, and nobody had yet established why a man who supposedly remained indoors after Edith left would have needed them. Reeves was comparing measurements when he called Fletcher toward the gate. "There's something odd here, Sergeant. The deepest impressions were concentrated near the entrance to the property. Toward the cottage, the prints became slightly shallower, although the difference was small enough that it had escaped notice when everyone was concentrating on their shape. Fletcher walked beside them without stepping into the snow. "A man carrying something," he murmured. It was Edith's explanation from the previous morning. Reeves nodded. "Possibly." "He gets lighter as he approaches the house." That sounded absurd when stated plainly, and Fletcher immediately recognized the problem. A visitor carrying a heavy object would presumably still be carrying it when he reached the cottage. Unless he had dropped or deposited something along the path and no such object had been found, Miss Marple had stopped near the gate. She did not look at the deepest footprint first. Instead, she studied the distance between the impressions. "Sergeant Fletcher," she said, "when you walk downhill, do you always know which foot made a particular mark first?" Fletcher gave her a puzzled glance. "There isn't much of a hill here." "No. But one can become very certain about direction merely because the toes appear to point somewhere." Reeves straightened. The three of them looked toward the cottage. The footprints appeared to face the house because the rounded ends of the impressions were oriented toward it. But the snow had softened the precise outline of the solace. Fletcher took Arthur's garden boots from the porch and brought them outside. When he held one above a photographed impression, the difference became immediately apparent. Arthur's boots were not the source of the prints. The size was close, but the heel shape was wrong. Edith appeared relieved. "So we are back to Major Bell?" "No," Fletcher said. "We were never properly at Major Bell." He ordered Reeves to fetch Bell's boots again, not because he expected a match, but because he wanted to test something else. While they waited, Fletcher returned indoors and examined Arthur's clothes. The trousers worn at the time of death had been removed during the medical examination and were folded inside an evidence bag. Near the lower hem of the right leg was a faint brown mark, mud. That was peculiar because almost every exposed surface around. Mallow Cottage had been covered by snow during the relevant period. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly afterward and provided a firmer estimate of death. Arthur had probably died between 10:30 and midnight, earlier than Fletcher had first believed possible. The estimate changed everything. If Arthur had been killed before midnight, then the murderer could have left before the snow began, leaving no visible tracks at all. The mysterious footprints might therefore have been made later and might have nothing to do with the killer's arrival. Fletcher immediately returned to the timeline. Edith had left at approximately 9:45. Bell had left earlier. Lucy claimed she had remained at Ashcombe Farm all evening. The housekeeper was in Much Benham. Several neighbours had seen no visitors, although visibility from the lane was poor after dark. Then Fletcher found another fact that had been available from the beginning. The whiskey glass beside Arthur's chair carried only Arthur's fingerprints. There was no second glass. Everyone had assumed that Arthur had admitted someone he knew because there had been no sign of forced entry. But nothing in the room actually proved that a visitor had sat drinking with him. Miss Marple listened while Fletcher explained this. "You think the murderer was already here?" "I think we have been allowing those footprints to tell us when the murderer arrived. And perhaps they were never intended to tell you that Edith, standing near the desk, turned. What else could footprints leading to a door mean?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "That rather depends upon whether they lead to the door." The room became quiet. Bell's boots arrived 20 minutes later. Fletcher carried one outside, pressed it carefully into a tray of loose snow collected from beside the hedge, then compared the result with the original impressions. The match was impossible. The heel was too wide by nearly half an inch. Bell had been suspected because his boots looked approximately right and because everyone already possessed reasons to distrust him. Fletcher crossed Bell's name from the top of his notebook. Lucy, who had arrived with the boots, watched him do it. "My father told you he wasn't here. People occasionally tell the truth for reasons that have nothing to do with innocence." She did not appreciate the remark. Edith intervened almost immediately, telling Lucy that Fletcher was simply doing his work. And once again Miss Marple noticed the peculiar ease with which Edith managed the younger woman. She knew when Lucy would become angry, when she needed reassurance, even how she took her tea. None of that was suspicious by itself, particularly because Lucy had grown up around the Harcourt family. Yet familiarity could reveal something else. It could reveal expectation. At 11, Fletcher received a telephone call from Much Benham concerning Arthur's financial records. There had been no recent withdrawal of a large sum, no unexplained debt, and no immediate financial crisis. The new will remained relevant, but its significance was weaker than it had appeared. Lucy would inherit eventually, but Arthur had also created a trust preventing the sale of Mallow Cottage for 5 years. The obvious financial motive was becoming less obvious. Fletcher returned to the path for one final examination before allowing the snow to melt naturally. This time he began at the cottage rather than the gate. He crouched beside the first visible impression near the porch, then moved slowly outward. Near the middle of the path, he stopped. One print contained a tiny ridge at its rear edge, formed where the boot had pushed snow backward while lifting. Fletcher examined the next. The same ridge appeared again, then another. He stood very slowly. Reeves understood first. The person wasn't walking toward the cottage. Fletcher looked at him. No, the footprints pointed toward Mallow Cottage. But the person who made them had been moving away from it. Someone had walked backward from the porch to the gate. The impossible visitor had never arrived at all. The footprints had been manufactured to create the appearance of an arrival after the snow began, and whoever had made them had started inside Mallow Cottage. Miss Marple looked toward the porch, where Arthur's old garden boots remained beneath the bench. Fletcher followed her gaze. "They're not the right boots." "No," she said. "But perhaps that is precisely why they were left where everyone could find them." He frowned. A false clue. Not quite. A reassuring one. Fletcher waited. Miss Marple glanced toward the sitting-room window, where Edith was speaking quietly with Lucy. When people arrange something artificial, Sergeant, they very often include one detail that explains what they hope you will notice, because an unexplained oddity attracts attention. Arthur's damp boots explained why there might be moisture in the porch. Major Bell's quarrel explained why a large man might have come here. The footprints explained how that man arrived, and all 3 explanations are wrong, perhaps not wrong. Miss Marple replied, "Merely useful to someone." Fletcher looked again at the backward trail. For the first time, the case no longer concerned a murderer who had vanished across untouched snow. It concerned someone who had been inside Mallow Cottage before the snow began. Killed Arthur Harcourt, left normally, and then returned after midnight for the sole purpose of creating evidence. That person had known the house. They had known about Arthur's boots. They had known about Bell's quarrel. Most importantly, they had known exactly what everyone in St. Mary Mead would be expected to believe when morning came. Once Sergeant Fletcher accepted that the footprints had been made by someone walking backward from Mallow Cottage. The investigation changed direction with remarkable speed, because the impossible part of the mystery had vanished and left behind a much more ordinary question. Who could have killed Arthur Harcourt before midnight, left the cottage without attracting attention? and then returned after the snow began to manufacture a trail pointing toward an imaginary visitor. The return mattered more than the murder itself. Anyone might have struck Arthur during an argument, but only someone familiar with the household would have known that his old garden boots were kept beneath the porch bench, that Major Bell had threatened him publicly, and that the housekeeper was absent for the night. Fletcher began again with the people closest to Arthur. Lucy Bell remained an obvious possibility because she knew the house well, understood her father's dispute with Arthur, and stood to inherit, but her movements became increasingly difficult to challenge. 2 servants at Ashcombe Farm had seen her throughout the evening, and one remembered Lucy helping with a 6 spaniel shortly after 11. More importantly, nothing in her behaviour after Arthur's death suggested that she had expected the inheritance. Edith was different. Not suspiciously different, Fletcher told himself at first, but different in ways that had been visible from the beginning. She knew Arthur's routines better than anyone. She knew which boots he used in the garden. She knew Bell had visited. She knew about the quarrel. She had been the final confirmed visitor to leave Mallow Cottage before Arthur died, and she had been the first person to discover the footprints in the morning. Fletcher went to Edith's house shortly after lunch. Miss Marple accompanied him, though she made a point of saying that she was only returning a knitting pattern Edith had lent her several weeks earlier. Fletcher had already learned that when Miss Marple offered an explanation for her presence, it was generally polite to accept it without examining the explanation too closely. Edith received them in a small sitting room overlooking the lane. She showed no visible surprise when Fletcher began asking about the previous evening again. "You've already had all this. I'm checking the sequence very well," she described, arriving at Arthur's cottage shortly before 8, finding Bell already there and remaining after Bell left because Arthur had been agitated. She made tea, cleared a tray from the morning room, and left at approximately 9:45. "Did Arthur intend to go out after you left?" "No." "Did he mention expecting anyone?" "No." "Did you touch the garden boots in the porch?" Edith paused. "I may have moved them." "I don't remember." Miss Marple looked toward the window. Fletcher continued. "When you found the footprints in the morning, you immediately suggested that the person who made them might have been carrying something." "I suggested it after you commented on their depth." "Yes." Edith's expression changed only slightly. "Is that significant?" "It may be." She folded her hands. Fletcher then asked a question that seemed unrelated. "When did you learn that Lucy took no sugar in her tea?" Edith stared at him. "I've known Lucy since she was a child, of course." Miss Marple turned from the window and Arthur. Edith looked toward her. "What about him? How did he take his whiskey?" The question appeared so trivial that Fletcher almost interrupted. Edith answered automatically. 2 fingers, usually, with a little water if it was before dinner. None afterward?" Miss Marple nodded. "That is what I thought." Edith's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing yet." Fletcher disliked the answer. But Miss Marple's attention had moved to a small brass coal scuttle near the fireplace. There was mud along its lower edge. Not much, but enough. He crouched beside it. Edith said immediately, "The gardener brought coal in yesterday morning." Fletcher looked up. "The gardener?" "Yes. Your gardener hasn't worked this week." I checked. For the first time, Edith did not reply at once. It was a small hesitation. Nothing dramatic occurred, and nobody accused her, yet something in the room had altered. Fletcher examined the scuttle more closely and found, wedged behind the handle, a thin strand of coarse black wool. Edith's outdoor coat was navy blue. The discovery seemed to weaken the implication until Miss Marple asked whether Edith still owned the old black travelling cloak she sometimes wore during bad weather. Edith gave her a cold look. "I donated it to the church jumble collection last month." Miss Marple nodded again. She remembered the cloak. She also remembered that it had not been included among the clothing placed out for sale. That afternoon, Fletcher searched the shed behind Edith's house with her reluctant permission. He found no cloak. He did, however, find a pair of oversized rubber overshoes beneath several empty flower pots. They were the sort designed to fit over ordinary shoes in wet weather, broad at the heel and rounded at the front. The measurements matched the footprints at Mallow Cottage almost exactly. Edith looked at them without visible alarm. "Arthur gave me those years ago. Why are they here?" "Because they're mine. Have you worn them recently?" "No." Fletcher lifted one. The tread was dry, but small traces of compacted white grit remained between the grooves. Not snow, salt. The village council had spread salt and grit along part of the lane during the previous evening before the snowfall became heavy. Anyone walking from Edith's house to Mallow Cottage after midnight would have crossed that treated section. Fletcher said nothing until they were back inside. Then he placed the overshoes on a sheet of newspaper beside the fireplace. Edith looked at Miss Marple. "You seem very pleased with yourself." Miss Marple appeared genuinely surprised. "Oh, no. I dislike situations in which familiar people have behaved badly. They are usually much more unpleasant than mysteries involving strangers. You think I killed Arthur?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Fletcher did. "I think you returned to Mallow Cottage after midnight." Edith's mouth tightened. "Because of a pair of old overshoes." "Because those overshoes match the prints, because you knew the house, because you discovered the trail, and because you gave us an explanation for the depth of the prints before anyone had established that the depth required explaining. That proves." "Nothing." "No." Fletcher leaned back. "But it changes what I need to prove." Edith stood and walked toward the fireplace. Miss Marple watched her carefully, not because of where she moved, but because Edith avoided looking toward the overshoes. "You still have the wrong idea," Edith said. "Then help us correct it." She remained silent. Fletcher asked about the black travelling cloak again. Edith said she had forgotten where it had gone. He asked whether she had returned to Arthur's cottage. She denied it. He asked whether she had known about the new will. This time, Edith turned. "No." The answer came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. So did Fletcher. The solicitor had stated that Arthur had discussed the new will with only two people before signing it. One was the solicitor himself. The other had never been identified. Fletcher opened his notebook. "Arthur changed his will 3 days before his death. I know that now. Did he tell you?" "No." Miss Marple looked at Edith with something closer to sadness than suspicion. "You knew Lucy was receiving more than books before Sergeant Fletcher told you." Edith laughed once. "That's absurd. At Mallow Cottage, when Lucy said she knew nothing about the will, you told her Arthur must have intended to leave her something. You did not sound surprised that she was favoured. You sounded surprised by how much—" Edith's face remained controlled. Miss Marple continued gently. "And yesterday, when Sergeant Fletcher asked whether you resented the will, you said Arthur's money was his own. You never asked when he had changed it." Fletcher looked up sharply. He had not noticed that. Miss Marple had. Edith sat down again. For several seconds, only the clock on the mantelpiece disturbed the silence. At last she said, "Even if Arthur told me about his will, that does not make me a murderer." "No," Miss Marple replied. "It merely tells us that the quarrel everyone has been investigating may not have been the important one, Edith's eyes met hers. Miss Marple did not look away. The footprints, the boots, Belle's threat, Lucy's inheritance, the damp solace, the salt in the overshoes, Edith's knowledge of the household, and even her first casual remark about someone carrying something had all been present before anyone understood what they meant. Nothing essential had been hidden. The difficulty had been simpler than that. Everyone had been looking for a man who arrived at Mallow Cottage during the snow. Miss Marple had gradually understood that the more important person was a woman who had already been there before it began. By the following afternoon, Sergeant Fletcher had enough evidence to ask Edith Harcourt to return to Mallow Cottage, although he still lacked the one thing he wanted most, a complete explanation of what had happened between Edith and her brother before the snow began. The physical evidence could establish that someone wearing her oversized rubber overshoes had walked backward from the cottage after midnight. But footprints alone did not explain why Arthur had been killed several hours earlier, nor why Edith had taken such an elaborate risk to create evidence pointing toward Major Bell. Lucy Bell came with her father, while Dr. Haydock remained near the fireplace and Miss Marple sat beside the window overlooking the path. The snow had begun to soften and the famous footprints were losing their shape, which seemed appropriate now that the mystery they had created was disappearing with them. Fletcher began with the timeline. Arthur had argued with Major Bell before 9:15, but Bell had left while Edith was still present. Edith remained until approximately 9:45, according to her original statement, although nobody had actually seen her leave at that time. Arthur died between 10:30 and midnight. The crucial discovery had come that morning. Arthur's solicitor had located a handwritten note made during their meeting 3 days before the murder. Arthur had told him that Edith knew about the new will because he had discussed it with her first. Hoping she would understand his decision to leave Mallow Cottage and most of his investments to Lucy, Edith had therefore lied. Not about discovering the will after Arthur's death, but about knowing it beforehand. That still gives you only a quarrel, Edith said. Yes, Fletcher replied. But now we know which quarrel matters. Miss Marple looked toward Lucy. Arthur's decision had not been primarily financial. He had intended Lucy to preserve Mallow Cottage because she loved the place and had spent much of her childhood there. Edith, however, had assumed for years that the cottage would eventually become hers. Not because Arthur had promised it formally, but because families often allow expectations to harden until they are treated as agreements. Edith's expression remained composed. You make it sound as though I killed my brother for a house. No, Miss Marple said quietly. I think you killed him because he made you understand that the house was never yours. Edith turned toward her. That distinction mattered. The argument had begun after Bell left. Arthur told Edith that the new will had already been signed, and when she protested, he dismissed her objection with the same impatience he had shown throughout their lives. He reminded her that she possessed her own house and income, then said that Lucy cared more for Mallow Cottage than Edith ever had. It was not poverty, desperation, or a carefully planned inheritance murder. It was humiliation accumulated over years and delivered in one sentence. Fletcher had found the probable weapon that morning, although everyone had seen it from the beginning. The brass coal scuttle in Arthur's morning room had a heavy removable handle. One end carried a shallow dent, and microscopic traces of blood remained inside the joint where ordinary cleaning had failed to reach. Edith had cleared the room before leaving. She had also handled the coal scuttle often enough that her fingerprints on it meant nothing. That was another reason the truth had remained comfortable in plain sight. You struck him once, Fletcher said. Then you realized what you had done. Edith looked at the dead fireplace. Her silence answered before she did. He laughed at me, Lucy shifted uneasily. Edith continued without looking at her. He's a tete, minding for rings that didn't belong to me. His meals, his housekeeper, his appointments, his Christmas cards. Then, he said, I had apparently begun arranging his money as well. She had picked up the brass handle during the argument and struck Arthur behind the ear. There had been no elaborate murder plan. The elaborate part came afterward. Edith left Mallow Cottage before midnight, taking the handle with her because she noticed blood on it. She cleaned it at home, then later realized its absence might eventually be noticed. When the snow began, another possibility occurred to her. Major Bell had threatened Arthur publicly. His heavy boots were familiar throughout the village. If someone appeared to have visited Arthur after midnight, suspicion would move naturally toward Bell. Edith returned wearing the oversized rubber overshoes and carrying the cleaned handle beneath. Her old black traveling cloak. She replaced the handle on the coal scuttle, then stood inside the porch considering how to leave tracks that appeared to approach the house without. Producing a second trail leading away, the solution was simple enough to be imperfect. She walked backward. Beginning at the porch, she stepped carefully toward the gate while keeping the overshoes pointed toward the cottage. Near the gate, maintaining balance became harder, so she pressed more heavily into the snow. That was why the prints became deeper toward the lane. Not because the visitor was carrying something, because Edith was walking backward and shifting her weight cautiously with each step. She then stepped from the gate onto the salted portion of the lane, where her return journey left no useful impressions. The damp garden boots beneath the porch had served another purpose. Edith had deliberately wet one with snow, hoping that if anyone noticed moisture near the entrance, Arthur's own boots would provide an innocent explanation. She had created too many explanations. Miss Marple had recognized that before she knew exactly what Edith had done. You were very quick to help everyone understand things, Miss Marple said. The deep footprints suggested someone carrying something. Major Bell's quarrel suggested a visitor. Arthur's boots explained the moisture. And Lucy's inheritance supplied a reason for family tension. Whenever something unusual appeared, you already had a perfectly ordinary interpretation prepared for it. Edith gave a tired smile. And that condemned me? No. What mattered was that you interpreted details before anyone knew they required interpretation. Fletcher closed his notebook. There was one final question. Why did you return in the morning by exactly the same gate? Edith looked surprised. It was perhaps the simplest question of all. She had needed to discover the footprints. If another villager saw them first, Edith could not control how they were described. By arriving early with breakfast, she became the innocent witness who found both Arthur and the mysterious trail. Yet that decision also placed her beside the evidence from the first moment, offering explanations almost before anyone had asked for them. Edith finally lowered her head. Outside, water dropped steadily from the porch roof as the snow melted. Later, after Fletcher had taken Edith away and Lucy had gone home with her father, Dr. Haydock stood beside Miss Marple at the gate. I suppose you knew from the boots. Miss Marple shook her head. Oh, no, I knew nothing of the sort. But you asked about them immediately, because they did not fit the footprints, the behavior. Haydock waited. Miss Marple looked along the path, where the impressions were already becoming shallow hollows in the thawing snow. When people encounter something genuinely unexpected, they usually ask what it means. Edith did something rather different. She kept telling us what things meant before we had properly considered them. Haydock glanced toward the cottage. And the footprints? They were much the same. Everyone asked who had walked toward the house because the boots pointed toward it. But direction is not the same as intention, and appearance is not the same as movement. By evening, rain had begun falling over St. Mary Mead, erasing what remained of the trail. The village would remember the case as the mystery of the footprints that went into Mallow Cottage and never came out, although that description had never been true. Nothing supernatural had happened, nobody had vanished, and no murderer had crossed untouched snow without leaving a trace. The evidence had been visible from the first morning. The wet boot, the unusually deep impressions, Edith's immediate explanations. The absence of returning tracks, her knowledge of Lucy's habits, her knowledge of Arthur's will, and the simple fact that footprints can point in one direction while the person making the moves in another had all been there. The snow had hidden nothing. People had simply asked it the wrong question. And Miss Marple, as she walked slowly back toward the village beneath her umbrella, understood once again that the most misleading clues were rarely lies. They were facts interpreted too quickly,